So, in order to give our victims the very best choices that they so desperately need, we really need to understand exactly what an arranged marriage is and exactly what a forced marriage is, because you'd be so surprised at how often we get this wrong, and particularly mixing up a forced marriage to be an arranged marriage, because one's a criminal offence and one isn't. So could somebody please tell me what they believe an arranged marriage to be?
By families or a middle person, and they have an element of choice as to whether to say yes or no to that person. A forced marriage, in my view, is when two people are introduced and they have no element of choice, i.e. this is it, this is the person you're going to marry. And there is a difference in the sense of, the greatest difference is that of choice and the freedom to make that choice, not just saying you've got a choice, but actually having the ability to make that choice freely.
Thank you. So I'd like to go through that in more detail, because we've got to be absolutely crystal clear and get this right. So an element of choice with arranged marriage, it's not. It's absolutely, it's free choice. So an arranged marriage is a marriage in which families take a leading role, but the parties have the free will and choice to accept or decline that arrangement. So everybody is consenting, and yes, families take a leading role, but everybody's happy about it. And as you know, there's been thousands of years of traditions of arranged marriages, very, very successful and very spiritual things as well. Yet a forced marriage is the absolute opposite of that. A forced marriage is a marriage in which one or both spouses do not, or in the cases of adults with learning disabilities, they cannot consent because they quite simply haven't got the mental capacity in order to understand what a marriage is in the first place. And duress is involved, and duress can include physical, psychological, financial, sexual and emotional pressure. So you've heard those terms a lot, particularly to do with domestic abuse, but it is so key, that emotional pressure to do with forced marriage. So that's a case that I've dealt with there. My mum says she'll kill herself if I don't get married. Can you imagine the pressure on a young person that the parent, that very person who should love and nurture you, is saying that they'll kill herself because if you don't get married, you're going to bring shame and dishonour on the family. And also, there's an area that people will perceive as being grey. So you may get a marriage that begins arranged, so a young person knows that they'll have an arranged marriage, they're absolutely fine with that. Their mum and dad had one, it was fine. Their siblings have had one, that's been good, so have their cousins. Yet they go through the education system and they might fancy somebody and want to go out with them, but they know the family will never approve of them, and they're not actually wanting to get married when their family want them to get married. And they may get flushed to the police out of absolute desperation, and they're saying to us, I don't want to get married because I've got nothing in common with this person, I don't love them, I don't want to marry them, but I've got to marry them because my mum says she'll kill herself if I don't. What you're actually dealing with is a forced marriage. And this is far more than two individuals coming together. So it makes it different from domestic abuse in that way. Because what you've actually got is the investment of two families. And particularly in the cases of first cousin marriages, that marriage has just got to happen. So where an honour system operates, are your forces set up to recognise that a first cousin marriage presents a significant risk? Some people are promised at the age of 2 to be married, and that's happening here. So if you've got an image of somebody kicking and screaming being taken to the altar, forget it, because it's not like that. It's the drip, 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 it's the coercive control, it's the mom says, I'll kill myself if I don't get married. And they'll turn up to the ceremony and they'll play their part, because why wouldn't they? They're surrounded by perpetrators, the very people who forced that marriage in the first place. So the ceremony, like the earthquake, but what follows is a tsunami. That's what the marriage is. And the Muslim Women's Network describe it as being buried alive. And a lot of our victims tell us, and NGOs and charities, that's exactly what it feels like. So we know also that this just isn't a South Asian problem. We know that forced marriage knows no boundaries in terms of culture, class, religion, wealth, sexuality, age, gender. It cuts across all of those. We've dealt with traveller families, we've dealt with Catholic families. The forced marriage unit that was set up in 2005 will say that they've dealt with over 90 countries of origin to do with forced marriage. And if I was a police officer in Germany, it would be the Turkish community reporting to me. If I was in Holland, it would be the Moroccan community reporting to me. Now, many of you will know about the case of Banaz Mahmod, but I want to remember her by talking to you about her today, but also pick up on some very important lessons that we still need to learn today, and one in particular. So Banaz Mahmod was murdered by the very people who should have cared and loved and looked after her, being her family. So Banaz Mahmod, to remind you, at the age of 16, she was an Iraqi Kurdish Muslim girl, was forced into a marriage to a man who was extremely abusive to her, both physically and sexually. Eventually, she was allowed to divorce him at the age of 19, but by that time, she'd brought a great deal of shame on her family, and she knew whoever her family chose for her next would be even worse than her husband. So what was her crime then? Her crime was to fall in love with a young man of her choosing. He was called Ramat. And one day, back in 2005, she was kissing Ramat at a tube station in London, where she was seen by a member of the Kurdish community. And she absolutely knew that that act of being seen by someone in the community would be enough to get her killed. So in absolute fear, she took the really brave step of going to a local police station and telling them that she'd been seen kissing a boy and that her father would kill her. So what do you think that officer, member of staff, thought when Banaz presented that to them? Pardon? Sent her away. Anyone else? Anyone else like to think what they might have thought?
I just thought it was an exaggeration.
Yeah, absolutely. What they did is they put their own value system on it. They likened it to something like, oh, my dad's caught me smoking, he's going to kill me. But they don't know Banaz's family. She knew her family, and she knew that that act could get her killed. And if there's one thing to take away today, it's how will your force recognise that we've got to learn to risk assess their perception. They know their families, we don't. And all those usual tools that we use to assess risk, such as P&C and our intelligence systems, these are mainly law-abiding people. You've only got what the victim's telling you, potentially some family history to support that. And the UK PPS, the Witness Protection, are very good now in recognising this and making people safe. And what, again, does that tell you about this issue? That people who are suffering forced marriage and honour-based abuse are getting taken into witness protection. So Banaz was killed and murdered because we didn't understand the communities that we serve. And if we don't understand the communities that we serve, then people are going to die. So have you got a problem profile in your force that lets you know where forced marriages and honour-based abuse are happening? Do you understand your communities? What Banaz's case shows us is the twisted and deluded concept of honour, and what we've actually got to frame it as organised crime. It's different from domestic abuse and child abuse. It's not one person involved. It's premeditated, it's pre-planned, and you've got multiple offenders. You've got moms, dads, sisters, brothers, cousins, the community, even extended community abroad. When Banaz was murdered, they reckon there was 50 people involved in her murder, and nobody spoke up. But through their silence, nobody was saying it was wrong. So there's many supporters of honour-based abuse. And all those sophisticated tools that you use usually with organised crime, we've got to reframe this and be using them in these scenarios. And it's a crime in action. So the recent West Yorkshire conviction for forced marriage and the recent West Midlands conviction for forced marriage shows us that you've got people being taken abroad, potentially kidnapped, Is your kidnap policy linked to your forced marriage policy? And if not, it needs to be, because you've got a very, very narrow evidential gap to support that victim, who may even be in a place we can't rescue them. We've got to be thinking about this as a crime in action, and you'll be dealing with things that are unprecedented as well, as the West Yorkshire case showed us. And one decision can sign somebody's death warrant, particularly if they're abroad. We've got to start getting this right and planning to do so before it happens. You've also got collusion and surveillance. So to remind you, you can see Banaz there talking to some West Midlands police officers. How we framed it was as domestic abuse. We didn't recognise the wider picture of honour-based abuse. And she's saying, people are following me. Private investigators, bounty hunters, they'll do it in the name of honour, not even for payment. They tried to find Banaz when she fled to the West Midlands and bring her back for the shame and dishonour that they believed that she'd bought. So it's massive in terms of your evidence gathering to think wider. They'll generally always be ahead of the family. In Banaz's case, it was actually her uncle. So you might automatically assume that it might be her parents. It was her uncle. And within 2 hours of Banaz seen kissing a boy, let me remind you there, by a member of the Kurdish community, in terms of the community involvement, there was a family meeting with 8 men around the table deciding Banaz's fate. Do you understand this about honour-based abuse? Do you understand that you need to include this in your evidence gathering? An associated risk, secret boyfriend, secret girlfriend. Ramat, Banaz's boyfriend, became a secret boyfriend. And where an honour system operates, that puts the risk right up there. Again, do you recognise that within your own policies? And I've just put there Oasis log. Within the West Midlands Police, calls that come into our organisation are recorded on Oasis. So that was a job there where it came in, my mother-in-law has assaulted me. Now, what you actually had was an arranged marriage, somebody who came from abroad who was absolutely consenting to the marriage, but the honour system locked her in, because what actually happened is she became a domestic slave. Again, are you linking the Modern Slavery Act and domestic servitude to forced marriage? And her mother-in-law, who was actually the head of the family, was assaulting her. You may have your image in your head of a little frail old woman, but she could be the head of the family. So we mustn't be missing these opportunities. So there's an NPCC definition of forced marriage, which is there. But it's not a crime in its own right. There's no statutory definition of honour-based abuse. But we've got crimes aggravated by honour-based abuse, such as kidnap, assault, theft, child abduction, and in the worst cases, murder. But that bit in red there, that's what it's all about. It's about restoring honour, or is it, which is a South Asian universal term meaning honour, and it's viewed as being more important to a family than anything else. It's a means of controlling behaviour. So just to make it absolutely crystal clear, really, what forced marriage and honour-based abuse is, and for you to recognise that this isn't just older generations, it's actually the third generation too. There's an organisation called the Jan Trust, who are based in London, who do some extraordinary work and go out into the communities in a way that probably the police couldn't because of the barriers that exist. And they went and asked some young men what would they do if their sister married somebody that they didn't approve of.
Luton has in the past been identified in a government report as an area of concern, and it's where I went to gauge opinion. Many who first agreed to talk to me
that you felt was bringing shame on the family
walked away when I told them what it was about. Others told me what they would do if their sister wanted to marry someone they disapproved of.
Obviously I wouldn't kill her. Like, speaking the truth, I might have to tell her, I might have to shout at her. She don't listen, I might have to slap her around. She don't listen, then I'll just tell my dad to deal with it with my mum.
I might take some small measures, such as, I don't know, just keep her in the house for a bit. I would know some people who would possibly, I don't know, take some guns out and take alternative measures.
So there you've got somebody in a Superman t-shirt. That could be on many of the streets within the West Midlands. You've got the third generation talking about how they will control their sisters, and brothers can often be the gatekeeper of their sister's honour. So this is happening right now. These cultures are so embedded and a means of controlling particularly young women. What I'd love to do now is to welcome to you a mother, survivor and lawyer, Rashid Begum, who will unpick some of the things that I've said and make them real, because this is her story.
Good morning, everyone. I can see some faces I know in the audience. Right, my story involves all the areas, really. You've got teachers, doctors, hospital, police, my employer, my workplace, the local authority and immigration, all involved. And by rights, I will be completely honest with you, today I shouldn't be stood in front of you. I wasn't expected to be here. And that is the reality of what you're actually looking at. So, for me, I was born into a very strict Muslim family. I was born and brought up in Birmingham, and I was controlled from birth, what Trudy has sort of outlined, really. Every aspect of my life. It wasn't as controlled when I was young, but as I got older, the controls increased. My mum didn't have any independent financial means. My father held all of the financial means and received any monies and worked. My brothers were there, they were expected to work, they could be out, they could have girlfriends, that, as long as we didn't know about them, of course, and they could have their own lives. But I knew from birth that I was subject to a very strict honour system. I knew throughout my life, as I understood more and more as I got older, what was expected of me. I was expected to get married, and I was expected to become the property of that household then. So it went from there, and it continued. As I got older, when I got to the point of secondary school, the controls increased. They knew where I was, who I was with, when I was going to school, when I was expected back. And if I wasn't back by that time, they wanted to know why. Clothing, I couldn't cut my hair, I couldn't take part in extracurricular activities, every aspect. So you go from that to then having people turning up at your house and all of a sudden gifts turning up. At the age of 12 and 13, I was engaged. I didn't know. I hadn't seen him, I hadn't been asked, I hadn't even had a discussion, but it was related to my dad. He was in Pakistan, and that's who I was going to marry. Now, I stuck my head in the sand to a certain degree. It has to be said, as a 12 and 13-year-old, you look at your own children and you'll see that this is not something they have to deal with. So it continued, the controls continued, the violence continued. At one stage, my cousin, who also went to the same school as me, actually was truanting and having a boyfriend, and she was seen by a member of the community. And on that night, when we turned back up, we had a meeting sitting there with all our brothers waiting for us, and we were then duly marched outside to stand in the rain in a car with people that had seen us. They were inside the car, and we were subject to our own version of an ID parade to find out which one of us it was, because we both wore the same uniform. So it was her. She went away. She ended up getting beaten up. I got taken back home, and I got told that for some reason, even though it wasn't me, I was still subject for additional controls. I was now driven to school and left at the gate. She turned up the next day. She had bruises on her. We went to our teachers. I said to our teachers, this is what's happening. We need your help. They didn't want to know. They turned us away. They either weren't interested or just didn't have the tools or knowledge to help us, or both. We carried on. I ended up in hospital twice because of further beatings, because I was perceived as not towing the line, not being subject of controls. Once I was shoved into a glass door, some of which went into my back. That continued. But all I wanted to do was go to school. That was my only outlet. That was my outlet. That's where I wanted to be. That's what I wanted to do. I wanted to learn. I wanted to have a career. I wanted to learn to drive. I didn't mind getting married, but I wanted to have some sort of choice, and I wanted them to choose somebody from the UK who understood, who I didn't have to babysit, who understood the challenges, who would, even at that point, I still remember saying, allow me to have a career. So the very things you wish for your children, I was denied. Most of the people would be happy and proud that their children want to have this plan from an early point, and this is what they want to do. Not my parents. So it continued. I got to the point where each time I went into hospital, the hospital staff let them back in. That happened twice. Then it got to the point where I was going to leave school. I'd managed to get some good grades and I wanted to go to college. And I managed to secure myself by negotiating with my dad to let me go. So I did. I went and saw the head teacher. I sat down and I remember her and she said, yep, you can come here. A week before I was due to go in, my dad said, no, you're not going. I was then virtually under house arrest. They knew where I was, what I was doing. That was it. So this continued until a week before my 18th birthday. I was 17 years old. And then I was told I was being taken on a holiday to Pakistan. Now, for somebody who hasn't been very confident, for somebody who hasn't had that much access to the Western world other than school, for somebody who hasn't been anywhere particularly, I just went along with it. I got taken to Pakistan, and within 5 weeks, I was 18 years old. I was less than, probably around about 6 stone. And one night, the boy's family en masse came down to the courtyard where my family were and said, she's here. This is happening now. And I just looked around and I thought, oh my God, I'm in the middle of nowhere. I was in that place that currently the forced marriage unit won't even go. They have local assets that will go in there, as in charities that they train that will go in there, but it's considered too dangerous. A few years ago, you will be aware of one girl that refused to go through with an engagement, and her parents were shot. That's where I was. And if you look at some of the areas and some of the reports, it is so isolated that nobody can get to you quickly. So I sat in a courtyard at that point, and what I knew is that not only was I on my own, I had no way of getting out. I had these people, my father and my brother there, that were saying that I had to go through with this marriage. Something clicked. And at that point, I turned around in the middle of the courtyard in the loudest voice I could say, and I said, no, I'm not doing it. Now, I knew that that meant I basically was dead. I was going to die there because they weren't going to bring me back. And I looked at my dad and I basically said, I know you're going to kill me. Kill me. But I can't do this. I won't do this. That then proceeded that I was bringing shame on the family, on him, and he decided that that just could not be allowed. There was work happening in that particular house, in my dad's house, and there was a courtyard and there were various shovels and axes around. And the next thing I knew, I was on the floor. I was being trampled on. I was being hit with various implements. And I just kept saying no. And at that stage, it just continued. I don't even know how long it lasted or how long it was. I don't know how long it went on for after that. What I do know is at that stage, afterwards, I couldn't walk. I had water on my knees. I could not walk. I could not make it out of there. I then went from there where I was looking at, my mum looked at me and thought, she's going to die here. She took pity on me. And to her credit, she was incredibly brave. She basically decided to leave the house with me and took me to her cousin's house. And at that point, what happened was that she somehow, unbeknown to me, decided to secure some money and some funds and gain the trust or the help of another relative and managed to get us onto a plane. And then one night, in the dead of night, after lots and lots of family meetings saying, why won't you do this? This is what's expected of her. I was taken out in a burqa, covered from head to toe, in the dead of night, put in the back of this van type of thing, where I was being driven to the airport. And as we were going, all I could think of is, oh my God, if we get stopped, we're both dead. I did not relax until that plane was up in the air. And at that point, I turned around and then it lasted for about a second. Because then I thought, where are we going to go? Who's going to believe me? When I land in the UK, what's going to happen? We had to walk straight back into my father's house and wait for him to come back. I was so ill that I ended up going to the doctors. I was underweight. They threatened me with hospitalisation if I didn't eat. I was physically injured. I was emotionally, and I was so thin that you can imagine. And I was 18 years old. I was fitting into my 10-year-old niece's clothes. And the doctor was worried about that. But when I was telling him about the other issues I faced, he didn't want to know. Nothing was done. After that, my father came back and the family meetings and the community meetings started again, and it continued. Why won't you make her do this? What about the shame on the family? All of those things. The elders kept coming. And there was me sat there thinking, oh my God, I don't know what's going to happen. In the background, unbeknown to me, there was an immigration case going on. They were preparing letters, a sponsorship, a bank account for me, where they were lodging money so that I could say that I'd fallen in love whilst I was abroad, and I was now going to sponsor this guy to come out to the UK. And at that stage, I only started hearing snippets of this. They then allowed me to get a job so I could get some salary payments into this account. And it then happened that at that point, I was escorted to a job in a van with a number of other females, and I was escorted back again. I then convinced them to let me get a job in the local authority. And that was a clerical job. It was my first job, and I managed to get there, and I was going in and out. But then they started saying I was becoming even more westernised because I was mixing with people at work, and I was looking at where I could be. It continued to the point where one day somebody was in the front room, and there was an elders meeting with my mum going in there explaining why she couldn't make me do what they wanted. And at that stage, I went in there and I said, it's not her, it's me. I won't do it. And if you make me do it, I will tell immigration what you're making me do. And at that stage, then my mum got up and started to hit me because I'd shamed her. After that, I was being followed. I was being checked. They knew what time I would get back from work. They knew what I was wearing. They knew what I was doing. I remember trying to convince them and negotiate. I negotiated for nearly 2 years just to try and make it stop. But it didn't. One occasion, I was shoved onto some stairs. I was, for hours, punched and kicked in the head, and all I kept saying was, this doesn't hurt anymore. I just want you to listen. And one day I ended up getting attacked with a pair of scissors and stabbed. And the defensive wounds meant that the tendons in my hand were also cut. So I managed to stem the bleeding that night, and I went back into work. As I was leaving, I remember my mum standing there saying, you're not leaving? I said, I am. I need to go to work. And I'm thinking, I don't know how this is going to end. I went into work. The bleeding started again. My manager saw there was only a small group of friends that knew. They saw, and my manager sent me to the hospital for emergency treatment. And they said I needed surgery. I went in, I had surgery. When I came out, they let my family back in again. After that, it continued, and my things were being searched. Anything and everything that I had was being searched. I managed to smuggle out my passport, I managed to smuggle out my birth certificate and some other items, only because I didn't know what I was going to do with them, but what I did know was that would make it more difficult for them to take me abroad. And then one day I found my brother following me, and he didn't realise I'd noticed him, and I thought something is happening. And at that point, I remember one day walking out of the house, going to the end of the road, and I think some of my colleagues or ex-colleagues on the West Midlands will know it was sort of a Victorian row of houses. Went to the end of the road, looked back and thought, I'm not coming back. Whatever clicked at that point, I thought, I've done everything that I can possibly do. There's nothing more that I can do. And all my aim was to manage 20 years worth of life in 20 days. That was my aim. That was it. If I could be out of there and safe and free for 20 days, I'd have achieved my purpose. So I walked out, I went to work. I had a really lovely manager who used to be a housing manager, and she decided at that stage that she was going to, she was there, she was aware of it, she'd sent me to hospital. I went in, I spoke to my friends, I spoke to my manager, and she said, right, now you've made the decision. She told my friend, you're taking some time off, and Rashid, you're going with her. She's agreed to take you. And I need you to go and get some toiletries, some things, and I'll contact you afterwards. And I left that day. I went around looking and picking up the bare essentials that I needed, went 20 miles out of Birmingham, sat there holding my knees thinking, I can go back and nobody will know. Nobody will know. I held him on my knees and my friend was there and nobody could understand. Got to the time that I was supposed to be back, and at that stage it ended up in a situation where I thought, that's it. I can't go back now. Hell's broken loose. They then visited my workplace continually. They took my 4-year-old niece out to try and emotionally blackmail me. They searched and spoke to people and camped outside my workplace. They searched and engaged immediate family members for searching me. They even reported me missing. And that was probably the best thing that they did for me, actually. Because when they reported me missing, what my manager did was decided to hide me in the back of a car and take me to Stetchford police station. And I met 2 officers, Bob Ray and Bob Russell. And they were ahead of their time because they had had a few cases, but at that point I was one of the worst cases that they'd seen. I was sat in a corner telling them what had happened. And at that stage, what they decided to do was, they believed me. You will never know the power of being believed in that situation. And they gave me that, which was their version of early safeguarding. And they didn't put their own value system on it. They took the knowledge that they had, the experience that they had, and what I was telling them. And at that stage, they told my family, we know where she is. She's fine. We know what you've been up to. We suggest you leave her alone. But they didn't. They followed them. They employed a private detective. They employed the taxi community. My details were taken off the National Insurance detail site, and my address details were taken off those. And what happened after that was that I had to try and get somewhere to live and still work at the same time. My site was changed. My name at that point, they put me under a different name so that I couldn't be located, but that made it difficult because the people around me didn't understand. They didn't know where this person had come from. It continued. I was found twice. The first time I was found was I turned up on the doorstep of the actual block of flats that I was in, and no matter how much you change your look or using a different name to try and safeguard yourself, the fact was that when somebody calls your real name out there, you're going to turn around and look at them. And that's what I did, and it turned out to be my brother. At that point, I phoned the police, and I gave them this, and you know what? That police officer didn't believe me, didn't recognise the risk I was under, or the risk the friend that was with me was under. So then I had to move again. And I ended up moving outside of the area to Staffordshire through this manager friend, and I was all alone. You become an orphan. You become somebody. These people may be trying to make you do something that you don't want to, maybe subjecting you to violence, but it's all you've ever known. And I'd become an orphan, but I'd also become somebody that was hunted. I got found again, and the second time I got found, I ended up meeting them in the police station. And I was scared, and I was frightened, and I went into that room and I said to them, okay, you push, I push back now. I was terrified. I didn't know if I could, but That's what I was saying. And at that point, what happened was I got subjected to blackmail. My mum was there. Do you realise what you've done to us? Do you realise what you are doing? Do you realise what, you know, where I am, what's happening to me? And that continued. I then became a police officer in West Mids, and I ended up going and sort of working there, and that to some extent probably helped me. But at the same time, I always had to look over my shoulder. Even at that stage, some of my colleagues in West Mids didn't know. Some of them have come up to me since and realised why some of the issues or some of the restrictions I had and why I acted the way I did in not going certain places. Sum total of that isn't to say this is what happened to me, but it is to demonstrate how much they will pursue you. When I got found the second time, because the first time violence didn't work, I got this. I had to try and understand my mum's point of view. I had to give her a chance. The amount of times my mum could not be well or my niece could not be well was amazing. And you continue, and you would think that they would have learnt their lesson. But over that time, what I can say to you is that since that time, there have been other members in my family that have been subjected to similar things. One left and suffered a mental breakdown and had to be returned. Another one set herself alight. So this isn't yesterday, this is today. You've seen the two prosecutions in West Mids and up north. The stories are not that different. So if the question is, do I want conviction? No. I just wanted it to stop. I just wanted to have a normal family. But that wasn't an option to me. Is prosecution always the answer? No, it isn't, but we should never just measure prosecution as the only point of success. It's about safeguarding. And we should always think about it as that it's part of the toolkit that you have to respond, to safeguard someone. It's part of the answer. And then there is the final point at which, for people such as my family, for me, things that I've encountered and others in my position, prosecution may be the only answer. And if I can say a little bit about risk, you've got variable life skills in your victims. That's what makes it particularly important that you realise and you don't lose them. The fact remains is that risk is what it is for them because they are losing everything and you're asking them to make the biggest decision of their lives. Decisions that my 10-year-old can make better and more easily than I could at the time. So in short, I shouldn't be here, but I am. I am a subject matter expert. Trudy and I have worked together many times. In addition to that, and being a lawyer, I've just passed my master's in international human rights. I have spoken at the Swedish Parliament, the House of Lords, fed into the law that was passed. And I think I may have worked on some of the cases that some of you have dealt with and supported some of your victims. And I was also involved in the HMIC inspection. But that said, all that I've done, and all people like Trudy and others do, is we want to stop it happening. And if it does happen, we want to help you help those that are the most vulnerable. So please give us a voice. Please give us somebody we can turn to and that we're not going to be turned away from. Thank you.
Rashid, that was so powerful. It's one of the saddest stories I think I've ever heard, but also to see you standing up here now and talking about it after all you've gone through, I thought was one of the most powerful stories I've ever heard. So thank you very much. And Trudy, thank you too. Thought it was amazing. I don't really know where to begin, but Rashid, you talk about stopping it happening. What is your best answer to how you do that? Is it about changing the culture? Is it about education? How do you do that?
I think it's important in terms of stopping it. Part of it is education so that we can try and prevent it and ensure that the people that are in those situations know they've got somewhere to turn. But the other part of that is also ensuring that the statutory agencies that surround them, and this is not just about the police, this is about different agencies that have different powers, ensuring that they are there to respond when somebody comes to seek their help. So yes, it is education, but recognising that at some point we're going to have to make the hard decisions and say this is part of the toolkit we have to use.
I mean, because you were failed multiple times by multiple different agencies. Do you think that would happen now?
It has happened now. There's some people that elements of that story doesn't change. When you look at the HMIC inspection, we did a victim engagement survey, and in that, if you look at some of the victim engagement work that we did, it was happening in 2015, in 2016. I support some victims where it's happening right now. I had a victim that I spoke to who was in York, who was put in contact with me, who didn't know what would be done, what she could do. Did she have to comply? Because her university course was coming to an end, and that was part of her negotiated freedom. So these are not things that are unique to me. These are continuing failures that happen. But there are other pockets that are immensely, there are pockets of really good practice, and one of those is some of the work that Trudy does and West Midlands does in terms of those particular airport work and outreach work, as well as identifying those perpetrators and assessing risk more effectively.
Can I share some of that work?
Yeah.
I've got some slides here for West Midlands Police Initiative that we'd absolutely love to share. It's out in the public now. We weren't advertising it initially, but if you go to Birmingham Airport now, you'll see on departures, don't want to fly, tell us why, and it's now changed to a 999 number. And on arrivals, don't want to go home, pick up the phone. We've had a number of rescues in relation to this, and this is to hidden crimes as well. This is an initiative that you'd like to work with your airport, and you could adapt this to service station, lots of different things. Then please get in touch, and we'll share how we've done this campaign. And then also some other initiatives that we'd like to share with you is we mentioned the West Yorkshire Police and the West Midlands Police case. There's so much learning from that we're unpicking, that we've done a significant investment in a structured debrief that we'll share nationally. And on the 14th of July every year, we hold a national conference, because that's the National Day of Remembrance for a girl called Shafilia Ahmed. That was her birthday, and she was murdered. And you can see the sentence remarks from her parents there. So in honour of her and other victims of honour-based abuse, we have a conference on that day to share the learning, to make sure that partners are fully on board, because often victims are flushed to the police. and they actually don't want to criminalise their parents, which is what Rashid's saying. So we've got so many barriers to get through because of the love for their family. But there's other things that we can do to make them safe by engaging our partner agencies.
And Trudy, what would you say when you hear Rashid, you know, told her teachers, you know, she went to hospital multiple times. How do you work with other authorities to make sure that someone like Rashid doesn't fall through the cracks?
I think we do a significant amount of awareness within the West Midlands. So you'll see another campaign we've done there called Ask a Rita. So we've thought of every single scenario you can think about to do with forced marriage, and we've made it into kind of a problem style page. We share that with our partners, we do events. We've recently worked with Birmingham City Council to do an awareness campaign around the link between learning disability and forced marriage, training their practitioners to recognise that this happens. So it's really about, this isn't a police problem, this is everybody's problem, and the police will be the last agency that somebody comes through for help. They estimate there's between 8,000 and 10,000 forced marriages happening per year in the UK. That's about an average of 30 a day. It's the tip of the iceberg. We get about a couple a month actually reported to West Midlands Police, so you can see the things that we're missing here. So it's vitally important that not just professionals know about this, but communities, neighbours, colleagues, everybody's got to get involved in raising awareness.
Got loads more questions myself, but I want to give you all a chance to ask. So stick up your hand, give us a wave. There's roving mics. Some great questions coming through on the app as well, but obviously always nice to see your face and just here, thank you.
Hi, Paul Bartolomeo from Hampshire. Well, first of all, thanks, Rashid. I'm sure I speak for everybody in the audience who said what a moving presentation it was. And I sit here not coming from a public protection background, but thinking, well, what can I do when I'm covering that command role in force to make sure that I do everything possible to try and minimise incidents like this happening? And that sort of leads on to my question. Certainly in our force, we have around about only four reports a month of honour-based abuse coming in. So I imagine we're quite low compared to some of the metropolitan forces. And that posed a question in my mind, you know, are some of the perhaps non-metropolitan forces carrying a greater degree of risk because we don't have that expertise, which leads on to a question about sharing best practice and what can we do, or what is being done, and colleagues in the room might know, well, probably do know considerably more than me in this area, but what is being done, particularly with partners, to try and identify and share that learning and expertise from not only successful convictions, but successful engagement with communities to early identify risk factors, our own staff engaging well with different communities to get that information back, that type of thing. I'm not seeing anything in Hampshire. Perhaps I'm not looking. I will look when I go back. So there's a question around, I guess, sharing best practice from forces where they have a higher volume and I would hope a better success for quieter places.
One of the things that will really help is organisations such as Karma Nirvana and other NGOs who keep their own stats about where their reports are coming into. So, and the forced marriage unit as well. So the police will have limited information compared to NGOs where people feel safer to report. But you're quite right, because as I said earlier, forced marriage honour-based abuse knows no boundaries in terms of geography. It will be happening where you are. And I think that you just need to make sure that your officers are trained. There's a training package and certainly a risk assessment, because that risk assessment is different to DASH for domestic abuse. It hones in on what honour-based abuse is, so it directs an officer to gathering evidence and also making sure that it's crystal clear what they're dealing with, because if we know what they're dealing with, we can give them the choices that they deserve and also safeguard them better. And making sure that our partners are linked in with that, and particularly to do with children's services and people who work with vulnerable adults. There's a lot of work for them to do and to lead on, because ultimately we're a criminal justice agency and sometimes we can't get that conviction, and it wouldn't be the right thing to do for the victim, particularly where there's multiple perpetrators, because if they disengage with us, then how can we monitor them, because they're not telling us that they're in trouble. So it's absolutely key that our partners link in.
question for you from the app, Rashid. What work is ongoing in communities to try and break the cycle of violence and control that seems to have been inculcated successfully through generations?
I think it's a mixture. I think some of it is sort of trying to get the message out, which happens every year with the campaign about, that it's an offence, that we need to ensure that that information is shared. So, as Trudy said, you have people that have been law-abiding citizens, and they've never come onto the radar. So the fact is, part of that is some parts of community work to inform, but equally, at the same time, it's also work in educational establishments. I mean, I've been involved in a number of talks with universities and schools, as well as some of the NGOs that I've worked with, where we try and inform victims or potential victims or friends of victims, but equally on the other side of it, trying to ensure that we have statutory guidance in place, which we have for forced marriage and elements of sort of honour-based abuse and key triggers. So there is that type of work being undertaken. I think from my perspective, I focus more on the victims and victim support and ensuring that they get, they have the knowledge to be able to feel that they can make the choices, because you do not want to re-victimize somebody by taking away their choices at that stage, because you're doing the same thing as somebody, some of the perpetrators.
Trudy, another question for you from the app. Could you help in understanding how we recognise the signs of honour-based abuse and the best manner of approach to those who we suspect may be suffering such abuse? Families are very effective in hiding such examples, and it's often difficult to unpick.
Yeah, I think there's many ways of recognising. You first got to understand why particularly a forced marriage happens. So that could be that there's an investment to do with property. It could be immigration purposes to get somebody into the country. In Shafilia's case, particularly as police officers, missing people, absolutely key for us. So in Shafilia's case, the family believed she was too westernised, and they used marriage as a means of controlling her. She was known to so many agencies, including police, because she would go missing, but we'd take her back again. And there's so many lessons. So Shafilia's family, when she was reported missing, they'd actually killed her. They said, "Don't use Ahmed in your campaign, because that's not what we do in our culture. We don't use surnames." And we can be misled, thinking that we have to be too culturally sensitive. Recently in West Midlands, we had 2 cases where, again, the family said, "Don't use our surname in any of your missing persons campaigns." If we don't understand these triggers that history has taught us, how are we going to support these people properly? How are we going to see the signs? So we've got to first understand what the motives are behind honour-based abuse and forced marriage, and we have to train our officers and set them up to identify it. And one of the ways of doing that is risk assessments, but also having really strong leaders. It's great that you asked that question over there from Hampshire. We're really privileged in the West Midlands Police to have leaders. We've got Danny Long sitting over there now looking at his phone, but he was very supportive. What he created within the West Midlands is the opportunity for us to do more, and also set Spocs up on our teams to make sure that there was an investment in our staff. All of our response staff were trained in a really interactive and innovative way, and we keep doing that. And I think the survivor's voice is so key.
Can I just add one thing to that? What I would urge you all to do is to say, don't consider any of this. This is an abuse. It is wrong. And sometimes your victims just need to know that. They need to almost be given permission to know that what's happening to them is wrong. And I know that sounds really small, but it's massive in terms of saying, actually, we recognise this. And if you approach it from the baseline of this is a breach of human rights, the most basic human rights anybody has, then you're not going to go wrong in terms of safeguarding them. Well, you won't if you use the tools available to you.